For 2019, Fender has introduced a new line of electric guitars called the Vintera series. This is a line of affordably priced vintage spec'd guitars that go from the eras of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Today we'll be focusing on the Stratocasters that are available from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s eras. Check it out. Hello Internet, this is Christopher McKee with Alamo Music Center in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. So we've already done a video introducing the Vintera line, but if you missed that or you haven't heard, Fender's done a new line of electric guitars called the Vintera series. It stands for Vintage Era. And see, if you make up a word, you get to trademark it. So the vintage era guitars are made in Mexico guitars that are affordably priced and recall vintage spec instruments and effectively replace the classic series that Fender had before with much more vintage accurate construction. Now we won't go into too much depth during this video. We really want to focus on the sound of these guitars. But what you should know is that the Vintera series focuses on the era of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Now the 50s and the early 60s are considered Fender's golden era. The 70s, not so much, but a lot of those guitars really have a special place in music and rock and roll. And as much as some people might be snobs when it comes to certain strats, like, oh, it must have a small headstock, or late 60s stuff, you know, isn't as good as early 60s stuff, the fact of the matter is late 60s stuff is what Jimi Hendrix and a lot of the other cats are playing. So there is a definite place for that. And what Fender has done is they have very smartly kind of aligned with very specific points of features from each era on these guitars that make a difference on the feel and the sound. So what you'll find from the eras is vintage correct neck shapes, radiuses, pickups, wiring, and hardware. Now within each era, a lot of the models also have a modified version, which gives you some modern hardware, a more modern radius in 9.5 versus 7.25, and a little hotter output on the pickups. The pickups are still going to be vintage spec for that era, but a little bit more windings, a little hotter output. We're going to go through each of these Stratocasters so that you can understand the difference between each one and why they're going to sound different just from a pickup standpoint. But no, going in, each one of them feels a little different because the neck shape's different, the radius is going to be different on one of the ones we play. The real key difference here is going to be in the wiring and the pickups to change the sound that you're getting. Right here, I'm holding the 70s Stratocaster. I'm going to put this down because I'm going to come back to it at the very end so you can understand kind of where we're going in the progression of the eras. So, we're going to start with, let's travel back in time. The 50s. So this is the Vintera 50s Stratocaster in this beautiful surf green or seafoam green. It's one of those greens. Really nice, and this is completely vintage spec. So you've got the vintage Fender's 50s colors, the neck shapes, kind of a soft V, all of that jazz. What's happening under here is where a big difference between all of these models exists. That's the pickups and the wiring. So the wiring is going to be unique, as are the pickups. The wiring on the 50s is formware wiring, which is what Fender was using back then. The pickups are alnico 5s in the Stratocaster, and they feature beveled magnets that are staggered in a 50s stagger. So the bevel means that there is a little bevel around each magnet at the top, and then the stagger follows what was accurate for the 50s back then. Now there's a story that these are beveled because the magnets would kind of get chipped, and Leo Fender, being a very practical, pragmatic man, had them bevel the edges to kind of get rid of the cracks and chips and not lose material, not waste resources. So if that's true or not, I don't know. Fender's telling the story as well, so we're going to go with it's probably true. These 50s spec, as well as the 60s and 70s spec pickups we're going to look at, have been designed and voiced by Tim Shaw, who is a pretty smart pickup guy if you know anything about his career. So that's what's going on here. Other than that, it's typical Strat wiring, 5-way switch, volume, 2 tones. When we move on to the next one, we're going to transport to the 60s. So, now this guitar might look familiar. This guitar was in our first video we did with the Vintera series. So it is a 60s, in this case it's a 60s modified. It's going to have a little slightly hotter output, but the tone is the same. And the way the pickups are designed and the wiring is the same. So on the 60s, you're going to get enamel-coated wiring with 60s pickups, again, Tim Shaw designed, which have no bevel. So either magnets stopped cracking or they figured out a better way to store them or something. So they're just flat-topped magnets, and they are staggered in a 60 stagger. So there were some tweaks to that. Why does that matter? This is important because the next guitar really makes a big difference here. The stagger of the magnet is basically determined how far the pole piece is from the string. Now, they're staggered in order to compensate for string gauge, magnetic pull, and the volume you're going to get from each individual string. So one string might be louder than the other, and if you bring the magnet down or you push the other magnet forward, you're going to help balance out the sound across the guitar. So in the 50s and the 60s, those staggers were changing. By the way, if you ever play a Stratocaster, it seems like the G's really hot. Maybe it was because it was made in an era when they had a wound G versus our unwound G, and so that's why your G string is louder than everyone else's G string. So that's what's going on with the stagger here. Now we go to the 70s. So bell bottoms are coming into style. We've got big headstocks and big hair. And this beautiful aged natural finish, which is new, that I absolutely love. Now, the 70s is definitely a bit of a departure. We've got the big headstock, right? We've got the bullet truss rods, 70s style tuners. We've got the 3-bolt pattern on the neck instead of the 4-bolt. And micro tilt is introduced at this point. And then we've got the pickups. So the pickups on this are using polysol wiring, still alnico 5. They are flat and there is no bevel at all. Now, when you play one of these, and what we're going to try to demonstrate is it has a distinctive tone to it, both based upon the pickup design, what's going on with the magnets, the wiring and so forth, but also the fact that there's no stagger, they're perfectly flat, gives it a unique tone, which I think is better suited toward rock and roll, rhythm playing and things like that, and some just fast lead playing. This guitar wants gain. So there you have it in the nutshell. Between the differences between them, we are going to play them so you can hear what the wiring and the pickups are actually doing to the sound of these guitars. Check it out. So there you have it, the new 70s, 60s, and 50s Vintera guitars from Fender. I think they're killer guitars, they're good value, they are more vintage spec than anything Fender has previously put out from their Mexico facility. And I think each one of them has its unique voice, characteristic, kind of personality that's probably going to be suited to a particular style of music that you like. I know, for instance, that these 70 guitars, there's some guys that are going to be, and some gals are going to be jonesing for these guitars and kind of calling back a certain era. So anyways, if you have any questions about these, go to our website, it's alamomusic.com. You can also go below, and we're going to put links for each of the models so you can go directly to there and check out all of the specs, photos, and all of the pricing and everything on these guitars. If you're new here, make sure that you subscribe, turn on notifications, and like our videos, and we'll keep doing more for you. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.